Whatever the occasion, effortless elegance is right this way. Because Hilton brings you new ways to stay courtesy of the Nomad London. And it doesn't stop at award-winning dining in a space draped in velvet and illuminated by vintage chandeliers. No, this day goes beyond with unparalleled personalized service and attentive hospitality. Oh, and did we mention the Nomad London can be booked using your Hilton Honors points at Hilton.com? Hilton, for the stay.
This episode is brought to you by Indeed. When your computer breaks, you don't wait for it to magically start working again. You fix the problem. So why wait to hire the people your company desperately needs? Use Indeed's sponsored jobs to hire top talent fast. And even better, you only pay for results. There's no need to wait. Speed up your hiring with a $75 sponsored job credit at Indeed.com/podcast. Terms and conditions apply.
You know that feeling when someone shows up for you just when you need it most? That's what Uber is all about. Not just a ride or dinner at your door. It's how Uber helps you show up for the moments that matter. Because showing up can turn a tough day around or make a good one even better. Whatever it is, big or small, Uber is on the way. So you can be on yours. Uber, on our way.
I'm going to get Guy to keep that in one day, Kieran. Hello and welcome to the Price of Football, show that looks at the money behind the beautiful game with me, Kevin Day, and Liverpool University's Kieran Maguire. I don't know what day this is going out, Kieran, but I don't know whether it's 1, 3, 5 or 7 days after you know what, but it probably wasn't the best interview we've ever done, Kieran, to be honest, because I was slightly distracted by something that happened 7, 5, 3, 2, 1 days ago. But it's I haven't even explained it's an interview day, Kieran. This is an interview pod. So this is the introduction. Actually, just get on with it, Kieran. It's Niall Couper, the chief. Hello, no, say hello, Kieran. It's terrible. But how are you, Kieran?
I'm very good, and I'm smiling as always, and I'm smiling because I'm pleased for you and Princess Julian and everybody I've got to know at the Pawson's Arms who have treated me as a long lost brother and everything that goes along with it. So even though I'm a Brighton Hove Albion fan, for you guys, you deserve it. You deserve to celebrate and hug each other and remember all the people that can't be there with you and so on. I'm just delighted for you.
Well, the bizarre thing is you're going to have to say all that again in about 3 minutes' time, because we haven't recorded the questions pod yet this week, which will go out way before this does. Anyway, this is an interview with Niall Couper. He's the chief executive of Fair Game, a group of clubs campaigning to improve football governance. And we're talking to Niall ahead of the Fair Game conference at AFC Wimbledon on the 28th and 29th of May. And as always, we could talk to Niall all day, but this is what we had to say. Niall, thank you so much for joining us this morning. As ever, we could have set aside 2 or 3 hours for this interview because there are so many things to talk about when it comes to Fair Game, Fair Game's ambitions, and Fair Game's worries about the game, which are pretty much the same as ours. I've already come clean to you, Niall, but I'm going to come clean to our listeners. I normally spend Sundays rigorously researching and writing questions, but the Sunday that's just gone, it wasn't practical to do that. So I'm going off the back of some lovely notes that you were kind enough to send on Friday, possibly anticipating that I wouldn't be in any fit state on Sunday to do it right. So the first thing I'd like to ask you, Niall, it's a phrase that we've used quite often on the pod recently, and it's technically insolvent. Why are so many clubs at the moment technically insolvent?
That's a very big question and a first one. I've just got to firstly say, I love your definition of the word practically incapable of being able to do the notes. Obviously, there was a small match that might have meant something to you, Kevin. So I kind of do forgive you for that. And I kind of realised that. And I have to say I was joking a lot around the idea of the parade down Norwood Junction past the Sainsbury's on the corner there and just seeing what it looks like. But we'll let that pass. So back to technical insolvency. So the issue really comes down to the pressure on football clubs to overspend. which exists all the way through the pyramid. Now, what's happened over time is that the amount of money that stays in the top end of the game has grown, and the gaps between the divisions has grown. So where you're left with is that because there's such desire to compete on the pitch, as you'd expect, clubs are looking to overspend to try and get up to that next level. So the gap between, you see it very, very obviously in the Championship and the Premier League, but it exists also between the Championship and League One and League One and League Two, and even League Two and the National League. So what you're having is clubs totally dependent on an owner to survive. And so that level of overspending you see as a massive consequence. One, clubs going to massively into debt, but also you're seeing things like community programs being cut, football academies going, as we've just seen really recently with Accrington Stanley, women's teams being cut, and backroom staff being cut, all to try and put extra money into the playing budget. Now, what that means is you're just left with clubs basically running the risk of, if their owner gets bored or dies, then that club's gone. And that's the issue that we're seeing. So I think we need to look at how we address that culture and how we look at trying to change those gaps between the divisions, and how we look at trying to reward clubs that strangely do things the right way, which is like you'd expect in any other business, kind of spend within your means, which clubs are routinely now not doing. And I'll give you one example. I occasionally speak to Millwall, and I know as a Palace fan, and I'll fess up as a Wimbledon fan, that might be an interesting example to pull out the bag. But Millwall considered to be one of the better run clubs in the Championship, and yet they lose. I'm sure Kieran will have the exact figure somewhere to hand, but I think it's something like £10 million a year, and that's considered to be a well-run club. And that just seems ridiculous when you talk about that. I mean, what other sector would say, well done, you're losing 10 million a year?
Yeah. First of all, to answer your Norwood High Street question there, I don't think that any trophy parade is going to go down Norwood High Street, because you might get a couple of people popping their heads out the Weatherspoons and the betting shops, but otherwise I don't think they'd be that interested. The trouble is, Niall, when we use the example of clubs like Accrington having to close their academy, or we see other clubs closing their women's team, that plays into the hands of those clubs in the Premier League who say, well, why should we distribute money to the rest of football? Because they're clearly not capable of managing their own affairs. When the reason they're not capable of managing their own affairs is because they haven't got enough money in the first place. So it's a kind of strange circle of irony, isn't it?
It is very true. I mean, I think the thing is, there is an awful lot of money in the game, and it's about who controls that distribution. Who's the one responsible for actually making sure those gaps between divisions are fair or not. So when you look at the Premier League and their share of domestic revenue, according to Companies House, has grown from 74% to 83% in the last 10 or so years. And at the same time, the share of domestic revenue for a League Two club has halved. So, the amounts that you can compete has become more and more difficult. So when the Premier League say we shouldn't be giving money to those clubs, actually they've been taking it away from those clubs in proportion, relatively, over that same period of time. So that makes it much more difficult for a club to be able to compete fairly. So I think that Premier League argument is a bit moot. But I would also add that there is obviously a reason for what you should be looking at, which is making sure distribution goes to clubs that are well run. So we would advocate fair game, the idea of the clubs that aren't technically insolvent and the clubs that actually do invest in long-term projects such as stadium infrastructure or academies or so on, are the clubs that should proportionally get more money, because that's actually encouraging long-term sustainability, which is almost like a dirty word in football. The idea that a club should try and invest for the long term, because everything is always about short-term investment.
I absolutely agree with what you just said, Niall, but the argument then is who defines what financial sustainability is, basically.
That is a really strong point. I mean, obviously, at Fair Game, we have studied a lot, work a lot with academics and experts to try and look at exactly that reason, and a lot of kind of kind of people, peers of Kieran that we've worked with for over the years. The one big thing about when you look at the independent football regulator is it's introducing the state of the game report. And the state of the game report, and we've been talking to the DCMS, and I know Kieran and others have been talking to the DCMS over time, to look at how you define football's financial health, as well as other areas. Now, that's going to come into play. So for the first time, you're going to have a centralised, independent view of how football is actually operating. And that is obviously going to produce a report that will say what's wrong with the game. If there couldn't be a better starting point for how you distribute football money healthily and responsibly, that's it. So if you've got independent regulators that may have a chance to look at the financial flow of football, and definitely will be producing a state of the game report saying what's wrong with the financial flow of football, then it makes an awful lot of sense to try and join those two together and make sure that any distribution deal has to address the issues raised by the state of the game report. It, for me, seems like a complete no-brainer. And that's one thing that we're really keen to see, that determined, that link made firm in the football governance bill as it makes its final stages through Parliament, because that could be really transformational, because that will be saying to all the clubs lower down the pyramid, there is a chance that if you do things right and you don't risk you don't go with a technical insolvency, you don't spend more than you earn, then you will actually get rewarded for it. And we'd also be looking at how do you close those gaps between the divisions that are the root cause of a lot of these issues in the first place. And it's all there. All the infrastructure will be there. It's about being brave enough to introduce it and try and make our football period that so much more secure.
Well, you could argue that one way to close the gap between the divisions is to take the Premier League out of the equation completely, because it's that desperate desire to get into the Premier League that's filtering its way down to clubs in League One and League Two. I'd like to bring Kieran in here, if you don't mind, Niall. I'm sure, Kieran, you could come up with a model of what makes a football club financially sustainable into the next 2-3 years. But then if we do adopt Niall's very sensible idea that they're the clubs that should be encouraged and given more money to, what happens to those clubs that haven't got time to become part of that? So you would need, surely, to give the rest of the clubs who are not managing their money correctly 5-10 years to do that, because otherwise you're cutting them off at quite an early part of this negotiation, aren't you?
Potentially. It's a very, very complex issue. I always give the example of Newcastle United, who are a sustainable football club under Mike Ashley. Speak to a Newcastle fan who was pleased with Mike Ashley. Nobody has open bus stop parades for sustainability. Newcastle United are a trophy asset club under the new owners, and they win trophies and they qualify for Europe. As football fans, and I can't speak on behalf of everybody here, but certainly when the number of podcasts that I go on to, the first question I get asked is, how much money can we spend this summer? We've got new owners. How much are they going to subsidise the club? And unless there's a change of culture within football fandom, which I don't see coming, I'll be honest, because we're interested in winning, then I can't see where the support for these changes are going. So whilst I think the changes are laudable, I just don't see that other stakeholders, owners want success, players want success, managers want success, fans want success. If that comes at the price of owners putting in large amounts of money, if we take the example of Chelsea, Roman Abramovich subsidised Chelsea to the tune of £900,000 a week for 19 years. Where were the objections to that from all other stakeholders of Chelsea? Certainly Chelsea's rivals and competitors weren't happy about it, and that potentially led to the creation of the cost control rules that we presently have. But it is a tricky one, and you mentioned the gaps between the divisions. How do we address the gaps within divisions? Because this is something which gets brushed under the carpet because it's not in the interest. Again, you've got to look at football from a stakeholder point of view. The broadcasters are not interested in Leicester City winning the Premier League. The broadcasters aren't interested in Crystal Palace winning the FA Cup, because look at the amount of attention that you got last week prior to the final. It was all about Spurs and Manchester United and how much money they're going to make from the Europa League, and I think that's unfair. I think you got the right amount. You got the right attention for winning it, because it was a fantastic achievement and it was a fantastic occasion. But the other parties involved in football aren't interested in sustainable football. And unless you can change those perspectives, I think there's a genuine problem.
Just coming there, Kieran, I think you're right about the cultural thing. The one thing that when we talk to boards of football clubs, the influential person often is the chief financial officer. So where you go towards, and this is the idea of, I had a brilliant conversation with the DCMS really early on in Fair Games history. And it was, if you want to change culture, reward it. And so therefore, the idea of saying to the regulator that actually what we will do is give more money to well-run clubs, that starts changing, because you then have the CFO saying, well, actually, if we do this, this, and this, we're going to get more money. So that conversation about financial things, I think trying to say to owners that you can't spend money is going to be really difficult. But what you can do is start saying, well, that there is a controlled amount of money that within the game, and that's the distribution deal, that can look at rewarding well-run clubs. So you start seeing a partial shift towards that. I think we're way down the route of being able to say, right, owners stop being reckless and stuff like that. And it's going to take an awful long time for fans to think, well done. Here's your open top bus parade for being well run, right? But what you can see is where you have your CFO and your board start saying, well, actually, there is money to be made about being well run. And that is the element that could happen, because that is the cultural problem. You're totally right. And that's the bit where you start doing it, because that's the bit that then starts securing the long-term sustainability of a football club, which is so far removed from modern football thinking. But it's the bit that makes sure you don't have the traumas and the disasters and stuff like that. I mean, at our Fair Game conference we've got coming up on the 28th and 29th of May, we decided to do an experience zone where we had all the, clubs were invited. We invited some fans groups that said, like, let's have a few tables, a few stalls just from clubs who've been in crisis, just so you can explain your problems and talk through it. And we just sounded out a couple. And we're now oversubscribed for that area, because there were so many clubs with those stories of trauma and financial woe. And it's just, when is this going to stop? And it has to be a cultural thing, and it has to be something that the independent regulator looks at, because for the first time, we've got a chance of somebody outside of those direct stakeholders that you talk about, Kieran, that might be able to change the long term. Is it going to happen straight away? Is it going to make a massive difference? Maybe not, but it's going to make a slight difference. It's going to change things, change that dial a little bit. And we need to have that dial moving in a different direction than where it is at the moment. So that's why we're kind of massively advocating for this. It's too much strife and stuff that we have in the game, and we really need to sort it out.
I want to talk about the regulator a bit later on, Niall. First of all, Kieran, I take it the postman's just told Finley that Palace won the FA Cup. Is that right?
That's right. Sorry about that.
Has he taken umbrage at that news?
Seen his ass.
No, I want to, before we talk about the regulator a little later on, I want to talk about fans, and when fans own the club, and B, their influence when they don't own the club. So we interviewed FC United of Manchester last week. And the question we normally ask member-owned clubs is about ambition. Would they ever consider not being a member-owned club, as they get further and further up the league? And with FC United, it's a very different answer, because they were set up in opposition to the Glazers. So they never want to change that model, because they never want to become anywhere near the club Man United are, not being owned by the fans. But you support a club in AFC Wimbledon, you've got a massive Wembley playoff coming yourself. You could end up in League One, you could head for the Championship. So where does the limit of fans, not loyalty if you like, but the idea that fans can own the club, how far can you take that? Will there ever be a successful Championship club owned by fans? Will there be, and this would be fantastic, could a club thrive in the Premier League owned by fans? Because it always seems at some stage a fan-owned club is heading towards the most difficult decision of all, which is when to stop being a fan-owned club.
Yeah, it's a massive one. I mean, I was on the board at AFC Wimbledon I've been on the board twice there, and it is one that comes up all the time. When do you say, right, well, we start looking at other things? The reason why AFC Wimbledon, for example, are where we are and the success that we have is purely because people are buying into the model of a fan-owned club and buying into the principle of being a fan-owned club. So that gets a certain distance. The moment that we stop becoming a fan-owned club, then the romance comes out of it. Some of our sponsors will pull out of it, and a lot of our fans will disappear, because that is the reason why people follow AFC Wimbledon. So it's quite a unique ecosystem within the fan-owned club community for that reason. And you'd have probably heard something similar for that from FC United as well. That's the sort of moral quandary you have. And it's one of the questions Fair Game is asking on the 28th. We've got all these workshops, and it's one of those is, how do you balance ambition versus sustainability? And that is coming from the fans directors. And it's really hard, because there is at the moment, with those gaps between the divisions that we talked about, there is a plateau, and it's probably somewhere around 10th in League One is probably where I would put it. I think as a fans owned club, if we were to get into into League One, and same as Exeter City, you're kind of flirting with the potential of maybe getting into the playoffs and maybe scraping into the Championship that way. But the Championship would be financially a complete disaster for us in the way that it's set up at the moment. It would be really, really difficult to compete. I've got a sense about that if Wimbledon make it into League One, we will have something like the third or fourth highest budget, and that takes into account third or fourth lowest budget, sorry. And that takes into account us putting in all the extra revenue that comes through from getting promoted into the playing budget without even thinking about paying off any debts or doing any other infrastructure stuff or anything like that. So that's the kind of situation you're in. So until you look at that element, then you're going to have a real problem. This goes back to, what does the regulator want of football? What do we want from football? Because there is financial ability at the top end, but it's like, what does that look like? What does that success look like? What is the model? What do we see as the ideal way of football being run? And those are the big fundamental questions we need to look at, because otherwise the idea of a fan-owned club at the top echelons of football is almost impossible.
If you've shopped online, chances are you've bought from a business powered by Shopify. You know that purple Shop Pay button you see at checkout? The one that makes buying so incredibly easy? That's Shopify. And there's a reason so many businesses sell with it, because Shopify makes it incredibly easy to start and run your business. Shopify is the commerce platform behind 10% of all e-commerce in the US. Sign up for your $1 per month trial and start selling today at shopify.com/promo. Go to shopify.com/promo.
At Capella University, you can learn at your own pace with our FlexPath learning format. Take 1 or 2 courses at a time and complete as many as you can in a 12-week billing session. With FlexPath, you can even finish the bachelor's degree you started in 22 months for $20,000. A different future is closer than you think with Capella University. Learn more at capella.edu. Fastest 25% of students. Cost varies by pace, transfer credits, and other factors. Fees apply.
I can attest, actually, Niall, to the popularity of fan-owned clubs, or perhaps the attraction is a better word. A very old, dear friend of mine, Mark Thomas, firebrand left-wing comedian, who for years argued that football was a distraction preventing the working classes from rising up in a revolution and overthrowing it. And I used to nod and go, yes, Mark, yeah, fine. Suddenly decided 3 years ago that he loved the idea of AFC Wimbledon so much. He's now a season ticket holder. And I get these bizarre texts from him going, we're playing free at the back. We need an overlap. Is that what? Well, who are you and what have you done with Mark Thomas? So he was just so attracted to the model. But I'm really interested to hear you say that were Wimbledon to change that ownership model, that you would lose sponsors. Because that's not a concept that I've ever thought of before, that there are people who only sponsor you because you're a fan-owned club.
Yeah, so there's the author John Green, who actually paid for one of our players.
Yeah, I know. That's the story.
So, like, John Green would probably lose interest in us if we stopped being a fan-owned club, because the reason he bought into us was because we're a fan-owned club. And there are other kind of our sponsors that buy into it for that reason. And there's a lot of our supporters that are there because we're a fan-owned club. It's, it makes us, because we are not the Premier League and we're not in that kind of mindset, that we're doing as well as we are doing. I mean, Plough Lane is a ground that is basically the home tickets sell out every week. We've got, our ground is too small for us, and we've just moved into a new ground. And that is almost certainly because there's a lot of goodwill for the kind of ethos of what that club stands for. Now, were you to start looking at football clubs more widely having that same sort of ethos, I think there's a whole load of people within the broader football community that would be interested in going along. I'll go back to sponsors and brands. Now, having been on the board again, I remember a conversation where we were trying to get an extra loan, and the whole argument would go through the whole process, and like Wimbledon were very well run in a whole load of things. Come to the last question: are you a football club? Answer: yes. Loan deal: no. Because frankly, the market of what football stands for in terms of being a risk is huge. So if you were to start changing that and saying, actually, you can invest in football and there is a moral reason for doing so, or there's and actually they're financially sustainable, you will start attracting a whole load of new people into it who see football as a viable and almost ethical investment, which at the moment is so far away from where we are. So I think there is a potential to do that. And again, I think that is where this well-run attitude and this state of the game report, where you start seeing people going, well, look, I'm going to invest in a club because it is well-run, is a way to look into the future. And that's probably where we need to move towards. It's that whole thing about thinking, what is going to change the attitude of the CFO of a football club? What is going to make a CFO think, right, this is actually worthwhile doing? And the answer at the moment is going to be, is it financially worthwhile?
But what you've just said there, Niall, about you can't get a bank loan, it comes back to the very basic existential level of football, is how you define a football club. What is it? Is it, as you said before, is it a brand? Is it a community asset? It seems if we can't even get that definition straight, and banks are unwilling to lend you money on that, then I know what a football club is. I know what my football club is to me, and I suspect the answer is the same for Kieran and for you and for most of our listeners, I would guess. But we need to, the wider world needs to know how important football clubs are to their community before they make decisions about whether or not to lend money to them, don't they?
Yeah, it's a really interesting one. I've had lots of conversations recently about whether a football club is a community asset or a brand. And I think that's where you start seeing a differential. If football clubs are seen as a brand or a source of entertainment, which it might be by some rich owners, then the community side of it kind of falls by the wayside. We have to look at how do you re-emphasize and strengthen football clubs as a community asset and something that is viable within a business. And that is doable. But the issue at the top end is that it's become more brand. And you look at the commercialization at the very elite Premier League clubs, where the obvious scenario is that the seat in a big Premier League ground is how much money can you make out of that seat each week, not who sits in that seat and what the history or traditions is of that seat. It's the tourist fan who comes in, pays over the odds for that seat for a week, and goes and spends a lot of money in merchandise. If a owner can manage to get a turnover of tourists in those seats every single week, and that's how you maximize the revenue. So it becomes not about fans, not about the community, not about the history, and not about the traditions. And that's a worrying trend, because lower down the pyramid, it actually is all about the community. it is all about that kind of embedment, and that's where you see this split that's going on. So it's a really interesting time to look up the kind of football economics and where it's going. When you talk about, how relevant is the Premier League to communities or whatever, I worry about that.
I think, Kieran, some clubs in the Premier League do realise that you can, or they want to be both the brand and the community asset. I mean, certainly after the FA Cup final, Steve Parish, in both his interviews with the major broadcasters, he must have used the phrase South London 5 or 6 times, and he must have used the club slogan South London are proud 5 or 6 times. So clearly he's one of the club owners who thinks, well, hang on, for the moment at least, if the fans still buy into this community asset thing, then we have to. And also you have to say that through the foundation, which is partly funded by the club is doing fantastic things in the community. So it is possible, even at the highest level, for clubs to be aware. I mean, you would argue that Barcelona are a club that are incredibly aware of how the club is as a community asset, but also how it is as a global brand.
I agree. I don't think the Premier League gets enough credit for the work that it does do in terms of outreach, in terms of the community schemes, the club schemes and so on, the foundations that it's set up. At the same time, these are assets which have been bought by investors who are incredibly wealthy, and some clubs pay lip service to their broader responsibilities. But provided they sign Carlos Kickaball for £60 million every summer, they will be forgiven by the vast majority of fans, for whom football is a form of escape from the drudgery of life. And they just want to see some excitement. They want to see entertainment. Certainly the American owners see football as a subset of the broader entertainment industry. And if Taylor Swift tickets are being sold via dynamic pricing, if Oasis tickets are being sold via dynamic pricing, if you go to the theatre in London and they're charging you 150 quid to watch a musical which came out 20 years ago, and you know what songs you're going to hear in advance, why shouldn't football clubs be treated in a similar way? And that will be the response. And also, and again, we've had the Premier League on. We've only lost Bury and Macclesfield Town, and they've been replaced by Phoenix clubs. So that's the argument that will be put forward against that. I'm fully. I work in the city of Liverpool. I see the difference that Tranmere and Everton and Liverpool make locally via their commitments. Could they be more? Yes, yeah, absolutely. But given a choice between putting an extra £30 million into a community scheme and signing a new left back, you put that out to a poll, and you know the response you're going to get.
Well, Niall, on the relationship between the club and its fans, because this is something I'm particularly exercised by at the moment. It's something we've been exercised by on this pod for nigh on 6 years. There's a quote that you brought to our attention from a championship chairman saying, football is an easy game to run if it wasn't for the fans. And that plays into the narrative that you talked about earlier, which is something that really worries me, is that those tourist fans who are coming every week aren't complaining about their experience. They're not complaining about the sustainability of their club because they don't have the same investment in the club that you have in Wimbledon, I have in Palace, Kieran has in Brighton. They're coming to see Wimbledon play one week. They'll go and see Orient play the next week, or Tottenham, and they don't really care about the history of those clubs, and they're not going to give the owner of those clubs any problems or feedback or attitude, are they?
No, it's totally true, and you're right. But I think the one thing, just going to Kieran's point about the Premier League argument about you've only seen a couple of clubs go, there's a whole load of issues about clubs that go into administration. So when a club goes into administration, what actually happens is a load of local businesses generally get 1p in a pound. And you see a lot of local businesses going bankrupt or having financial problems. And that's the consequence of it. So the club might still exist, but loads of local businesses don't. And the knock-on effect it has to that area is really significant. So I find that argument a bit disingenuous to say that it's okay because the club still exists in name. But the reality is lots of businesses have suffered. So if you're looking about trying to create, I love this argument. It's if you're looking at trying to create the growth agenda that we're supposed to be on, actually investing in local football clubs and putting more money into local football clubs, and you have proper limits on players' wages or salary caps, which we can talk about, then you actually start seeing a growth in all those cities and towns which have local football clubs, because they're the ones investing using their infrastructure in local businesses. So it actually is a real big benefit for the whole country to look at a fairer financial flow in football, because it is those local businesses that fold when a club goes into administration. And it's very naive of the Premier League just to think because a club's still there that there hasn't been a knock-on effect. And we'll go back to the fact that we've got our conference and that we had so many clubs wanting to be in that experience zone, we call it, because they've all gone through that pain. They've all experienced it firsthand, and there's too many of them.
I mean, to give the EFL some credit here, if a club goes into administration and gets an immediate penalty, points-wise, so it's a discouragement, and also it gets a further points deduction unless it pays 25 pence in the pound. So I think steps have been undertaken, and I'm not here. I come from an insolvency background. I can assure you, in my experience, there are other industries which have far greater rates of insolvency than the football industry. And I think it has learnt its lessons following the failure of ITV Digital and the spate of administrations, some of which were deliberately manipulated by owners to take advantage of the old rules, which resulted in the change of the rules. I'm just a bit sceptical as to how you're going to get fans on board with this.
I don't think it's going to happen tomorrow. It's not immediate. It's about the slow shift. Like I say, I mean, what we've got to try and do is stop the shift, the drift, which is definitely away from a kind of competitive balance, and it's definitely away from fan involvement. We've got to look at trying to see how we can start turning that dial a little bit in the other direction. It's not going to happen overnight, and I think you're totally right to be sceptical, because the direction of travel is very much in the other way. But it's about time people started making a stand and saying, well, actually, there is an alternative future. There is a different way of how football can be run. And there is the opportunity for, looking at people who are trying to do good through football, people who are trying to make, really actually give fans the proper say, really look about how you make things financially sensible. And that is possible. I think the state of the game report from the regulator is a real opportunity to put a proper focus on that is going to be in a regulatory framework that says, well, we've got to do something because it's going to be really public and it's going to be really obvious. And linking the two between that and the distribution deal is a potential to do it. I don't doubt your skepticism. I don't disagree with your skepticism. I can see totally about that. But it's, for me and for the fans groups and for the clubs that, Fair Game represents, and for the charities that we talk to and the academics we talk to, it's like, well, we can't just keep this going on, because it's basically drifting away from a point about really what is the point of the football pyramid. Because it's, this could be the first year where you see 3 clubs going up that all have parachute payments and 3 clubs going down that all got promoted the year before. And when does that become the norm? Because it's going to become the norm, because you've got a gap between the Premier League, the clubs who receive the parachute payments, and the rest of the Championship. It's like, it isn't a parachute payment, it's a trampoline payment. These are clubs that are just going on a little nice sabbatical in the Championship just to see a few other grounds before they go back up again, before they go down again. And it's like, is that the kind of pyramid that we want to see?
I think people are genuinely concerned about it. It's not addressing the problem of the imbalances within the Premier League itself, which results in these clubs being immediately relegated. So therefore, unless you take a holistic approach, then you simply change the colour of the problem from red to green or from blue to yellow, whatever it's going to be. And that will not be addressed, because the Big Six managed to extract so many concessions 8 or 9 years ago with the constant threat of setting up Super League until they played their card, that we now have a situation where there is a 80% chance of being relegated. And if you address that problem, then perhaps you can address some of the issues in the Championship as well.
We've reached a stage, though, have we not, where even Sky over the weekend were referring to the Burnley-Sunderland playoff final as the right to become the favourite to get relegated from the Premier League next season. So even they're showing a certain realism. Apologies for disappearing, by the way. There was a rather vigorous knock at my door. Very vigorous, considering it was my 91-year-old neighbour, who's a Palace fan, who apologised for not coming round yesterday, but you see his hangover was too bad. He wanted to come in for a chat and a cup of tea. He listens to Talk Sport. He wanders around the streets in various old Palace tops, listening to Talk Sport and getting very excited. Just two things to finish, Niall. Talking about the period, and I apologise if this concept came up while I was away, but we've had people talk before, to Kieran, to myself, to you. The pyramid is an almost sacred thing in English football, but there are people who have said to us, it's not even a pyramid anymore, is it? It's a kind of giant skyscraper that is there to support the Premier League. Basically, this whole infrastructure is there to support the Premier League and give it some kind of credibility, some kind of history and tradition. And that in reality, if it is a pyramid at all, it's a pyramid that most clubs can't make their way to the top of. Would you agree with that?
100%. I mean, I call it a greasy pole. There's no real pyramid element to it. When we look from a fair game perspective, we kind of identified the gap between League One and League Two as about the only one that's probably sustainable, and that's it. All the way through down to National League North and South, and it's such a crumbling ecosystem that exists for that pyramid. It isn't that, and I think people have to realise that kind of mythical dream is gone. And until we look at trying to address those concerns, then it's just basically not realistic. I think there is, going back to the idea about the difficulties in the Premier League itself. That's a lot to do with the distribution of European wealth and how that works, and that's a whole nother can of worms about how that's distorting football across the whole of Europe. And that's something that also needs to be addressed, because you're just looking at the concentration of wealth within the hands of a few, and it's really not helping the wider game. And that's the reality. And it takes a brave politician to actually say, right, well, actually, we need to do something about this, because otherwise we're not going to have the kind of pyramid that we want existing in this country, because it is crumbling. I mean, there's some great atmospheres happening at lower league clubs, but reality, the Premier League's a different game.
McCrispy strips are now at McDonald's. I hope you're ready for the most dippable chicken in McDonald's history. Dip it in all the sauces. Dip it in that hot sauce in your bag. Dip it in your McFlurry. Your dip is your business. McCrispy strips at McDonald's.
Did you know that parents rank financial literacy as the #1 most difficult life skill to teach? Meet Greenlight, the debit card and money app for families. With Greenlight, you can send money to kids quickly, set up chores, automate allowance, and keep an eye on your kids' spending with real-time notifications. Kids learn to earn, save, and spend wisely, and parents can rest easy knowing their kids are learning about money with guardrails in place. Try Greenlight risk-free today at greenlight.com/Spotify.
Talking of the Premier League, I'm going to end the interview now, but giving you the opportunity to tell us more about the Fair Game Conference that's coming up. But before that, just on the idea of the Premier League, and we've discussed the regulator right from the start of this interview, and there are many people like myself, many people like fans of AFC Wimbledon, fans of Exeter City, who think that the regulator is going to be a magician, basically, who solves our problems, who puts the game back on a level playing field and lets us start again and comes up with a new model of distribution. Well, A, do you think that's possible? B, there's also the argument that you've mentioned before in other interviews that the Premier League sees itself as the regulator, and the Premier League actually thinks it's doing quite a good job. Kieran's mentioned the amount of money that the Premier League spends on community issues. So I'd be interested in your answer to both those points.
I'll start with B. So the amount of money that the Premier League gives to it's the Premier League deciding who gets the money, right? So it's the Premier League deciding who's rewarded on a whole range of different things. Now, my mind would be, why should the Premier League be making those decisions? Why should the Premier League be having that? If that was given to, arguably something like the Football Foundation, and that it was the Football Foundation who made the decisions about who got the money, because the Football Foundation has a whole load of criteria about how you run yourselves and the kind of, how you get your grants and all the rest of it that they go through. And that's a fair analysis. And I know there is a link between the Football Foundation and the Premier League, but if you made that independent, then you could look at actually having a fairer look at how that money is distributed and how it helps the wider ecosystem, without the Football Foundation then going, oh, we mustn't annoy the Premier League because they're the ones who give us all this sort of stuff. So it's this vested interest element. It's a load of soft power that's happening in football through who the Premier League fund. And you see a lot of voices not being, as you'd expect to be, as vocal as they could be in opposition to the Premier League, because lo and behold, they're funded by the Premier League. So that's the argument to be. In terms of whether there is the opportunity of that a fairer financial distribution, it is that link between the State of the Game report and the distribution deal that the regulator could do. It is within the grasp of our politicians right now. So they sit down, the committee stages of the bill start on the 3rd of June. They'll run until the 24th of June, and it'll go to report stage. During that period, there is the opportunity for politicians to say, we will link the findings of the State of the Game report to the distribution deal, and that any distribution deal must address the concerns raised by the State of the Game report. That is something that is very much within the possibilities of what the bill could end up with. That actually could help address a lot of the concerns we're talking about. So I think there is the possibility, there is that opportunity. It takes the politicians to be brave enough to think holistically, as Kieran was saying, about the whole of the pyramid and not just at the very top end, because there is that element. And it is there. All the elements are going to be created. They're all going to be in place. It's about just making sure they are linked together with not like some kind of vague, oh, they might do. It needs to be actually spelt out. And if it is spelt out, then we've got a chance. Obviously, we then go on to what's the State of the Game report cover, but at least we've got that opportunity, because people like Kieran and others will probably be involved potentially in what the State of the Game report might cover. And, you only got to look through the kind of research papers that so many really clever academics and people who are experts in the game have looked at over the years to see, right, the problems that we're talking about are ones that are really real and they can be addressed. And it's just linking the two.
No, I can only apologise now for a slight lack of focus in the interview this morning. At one stage, you turned into Ollie Glasner and Kieran turned into Prince William, handing the FA Cup over. But I want to finish by giving you the final word. First of all, tell us a little bit about the Fair Game Conference, but also tell us a little bit about how our listeners, most of whom will be 100% behind the ethos of Fair Game, how they can get involved in Fair Game in the future.
So, Fair Game is largely a volunteer organisation. And what we try and do is deliver a fairer future for football. So that's our ambition. And it's across a whole range of different areas. We look at governance, financial sustainability, equality standards, community engagement, fan engagement, and we champion all of those. So you can go to our website. You can directly email me at niall.couper with a weird U thrown in it for good measure. It's COUPER at fairgameuk.co.uk. And, we're happy to talk about that. The Fair Game Conference is a kind of pinnacle about what Fair Game is trying to do. We believe in a fairer future for football. It's happening on the 28th and 29th of May at AFC Wimbledon. The first day is 15 workshops. Those workshops are all about the issues that have been identified within the game. We've been talking to the regulator and other authorities, and they cover things from sexism in the men's professional game. to how you develop a fair financial flow. What is a fan is another question that we ask, because the football regulator has got all this stuff about fan consultation without ever saying what actually is a fan. So all of those sort of elements and many more are going to be discussed. And the idea of those workshops is to have people who've got a real sense about wanting to see change to come out of those workshops with a solution. So obviously they're all timed in a classic football way to last 90 minutes. And so the idea is that, you will be presented with a document. There will be a facilitator, and there are some really good ones like Nick McGinn is doing one on sports washing, who heads Fair Square. We've got Steve Menery doing stuff on multi-club ownership. The people who know their onions hosting those workshops. And then the idea is to come out with solutions. That's the first day. And the second day is the usual kind of panels and stalls. So the panels involve people like Kelly Simmons talking about the women's game. You've got Jenny Frampton, one of the first female referees. I think she's doing some weird thing with red cards and yellow cards for the audience. I have no idea what that's going to look like. Big session on equality matters, so with women in football and level playing field, and Showbase and Red Card doing a panel there. And we're ending with stuff on European Super League, so which has sports groups and Spurs and Chelsea, and Philippe Auclair is hosting that. So that should be a really good one with the Union of European Clubs looking at that. So it's a whole load of really good things going on. So we have that experience zone with all those football clubs, and we have another football for good stalls as well. So there's lots of really good stuff going on. Everybody in the room is there because they want to see football be better. They want to see a fairer future for football. It's not kind of a corporate vibe, so we're asking people to wear club colours. We're asking people to wear, or a shirt from the organisation they represent. But it's about that kind of fun, practical, engaging. We want people to talk to each other. And it's happening, I say, Heads Women, 28th, 29th of May. Go onto our website, fairgameuk.org. It's easy to get tickets from there. So it should be a really good experience. We've got representatives of some of the leagues there as well. So it's not, it is people there who want to make a difference.
Niall, I hope that goes well. Thank you for talking to us. Good luck at Wembley. Turns out it's quite good fun when you win. Who knew? All the best, mate.
Cheers. Thanks, Kevin.
I was particularly interested, Kieran, in two things that Niall said about how it's the chief financial officer rather than the chief executive officer who's the most important person at a club these days. And also something I don't think we ever really fully discussed, this idea of the distribution of European wealth, which the Premier League would argue isn't fairly distributed to them, which seems almost counterintuitive.
Yeah, I mean, if we look at the second issue first, Steve Parish has mentioned on many occasions that there is a ceiling for clubs who want to be competitive. Now, that might seem a little bit churlish, given that you've just beaten Manchester City in the FA Cup final, which I'll say as often as you want me to. Checks in the post. But in terms of clubs being able to challenge for the Premier League itself, it does become more difficult. I've had it as an issue for some time. We are speaking to the Union of European Clubs in a few weeks about this very issue. And it's something which tends to go underneath the radar. And I'm not having a dig at the stakeholders from the media, because they want the big clubs to dominate, because they deliver in terms of interactions, in terms of clicks, in terms of viewings and so on. So therefore, why would anybody else say, actually, the success of European football has led to a further concentration of wealth, decision-making and power in the hands of relatively few clubs. If you take a look at the European Clubs Association itself, again, it's got many members, but only a few of them can vote, which was broadly the premise of Project Big Picture, which would effectively transfer control of the domestic game to 6 clubs. So, yes, I agree with Niall that if we choose to ignore the distribution issues of European football, I think we are being a bit naive. But you'll find out just how much you'll get in a few months' time. When I'm amazed that we've not had a listener's question from Kevin from South London. How much do you get for the Europa League? And that one might have been accelerated through. In terms of the CFO, the Chief Financial Officer, ultimately the Chief Financial Officer's remit is to carry on the instructions of the club owner. So their views are listened to. If the club owner is putting the money in, as we see every week, we've just seen some money come in from Preston's owners as per usual. It's £1 million a month. We see the same at Millwall, Bristol City. All of these club owners are doing this on a regular basis. It's when that check doesn't arrive that the problems start to arise.
Yeah, we got the Charity Shield to negotiate before we start thinking about the Europa League, Kieran. Apparently we're straight into the final. That I didn't realise. And by all accounts, we also get a bye into the third round of the Carabao Cup.
You do indeed.
Well, I mean, that came as an extra little bonus. 9:30 on Saturday night. Don't forget, you can now join our Price of Football Club, where you'll get ad-free listening, bonus episodes and more. Just go to priceoffootball.com, click on Join the Club to sign up today. If you have a question you'd like answered on the show, email us at questions@priceoffootball.com. Don't forget you can follow us on Twitter, X, and you can find us on YouTube. And if you'd like to buy our book, you can find details on our website, priceoffootball.com. Bye, everybody.
Bye.
The Price of Football. The Price of Football.